Well, hello everyone. I'm Isaac Pellerin with 120 Water, and last week the EPA on Tuesday, November 20th, released a press release and a memo about the IIJA funding allotments, and there was a lot of information in there. It's something we were expecting and we were waiting on, and because there was a lot to sort through, I asked Jonathan Cuppett, our Director of Water Quality Compliance, to help break it down. And so, Jonathan, thank you for taking the time to kind of read through everything and kind of boil us down into a couple of key points. Yeah, would love to turn it over to you so we can start having a conversation of like what stood out and what should folks be looking at as they sort through this, and what actions should they be taking.
Yeah, well, thanks, Isaac. And as Isaac mentioned, there was a lot of information that was put out by EPA. And so what I did is tried to go through and organize this information a little bit. And so I've basically created a slide, if you will, that has a link to all of the information, or all the different pieces of information. And so we're going to go through those quickly today, open up a couple of them and talk in more detail. But this slide right here really lists like what I would say are the 13 pieces of information that are most relevant. And so we'll just start with number one, which was really just the general press release letting everyone know that this $3 billion, which is allocated annually from 2022 through 2026, has now been allocated specifically to the states. And this is the lead service line replacement allocation out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In addition to that expectation we were waiting for in that memo, it talked about so there was some unspent funds in 2023 and 2024, and those have been redistributed. We'll talk about that later. And then another big piece that's in the memo, we've been hearing about these estimates of lead service lines across the country, somewhere around 9 million. We've been using that number in the industry, and now we have a really, really big change. And the latest estimate is going to be 4 million coming out of EPA, and that's for lead service lines and galvanized requiring replacements. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So that all of that is in the memo. In addition to the memo, there is a dashboard that EPA released, and we'll just wait for that to hopefully come up. Isaac, are you seeing
Yeah.
this?
Yep, there it is.
Okay. So if you just click on that link, this is going to take you to a dashboard that EPA has put together. And the top of this, actually something pretty important. There is a link to some information on the seventh Dwinza. That has some things I'm going to be talking about later. So that's the only place I was able to find that link. So that's at the top. But the real information here in this dashboard, obviously, is a summary of all of these service line inventories that were submitted across the country. And we have the ability to break that down by region, or if you scroll down by state. But here's just a look at the national level. And what we can see here is there's about 1 million galvanized requiring replacement service lines, around 2 million lead service lines, and then we still have around 24 million unknown service lines, and then around 73 million non-lead service lines. So again, we talk about that 4 million estimate from EPA. That is essentially 3 million, 2 million lead, 1 million GRR. And then some of those 24 million unknowns, about 1 million of those are predicted or estimated to be either lead or GRR. So that's where we kind of come up with that 4 million number. If you continue to scroll down on this dashboard, you're going to see a table essentially with a bunch of rows from water systems. This contains every single community and non-community water system in the country, and essentially what their inventory looks like, what they submitted to EPA. So Isaac, I don't know if you have any thoughts or
Yeah.
comments on that, but this is a very, very powerful tool, very lots of important information in
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I think if you scroll up, to me, what stands out is up until 2024, everyone was operating under a having their inventory in various formats. So there's really was a big deal for utilities across the country to kind of standardize how they report the service lines, and this lets us have an aggregate view, drill down, how systems compare, how the system where you're from, wherever you're watching this video, how that compares. And this lines up with a lot of the tools that utilities are using for their internal operations to kind of organize the information, organize their teams to tackle this project in the future. So I think this is a big, to me, what this represents is a good step in transparency and public transparency at the national level, broken down by region, and down to the utility level. And so I really was excited to see this published in this way.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I will just say, we didn't have time to go through all the different nuances of that, but there's just a ton of information. You can sit in there and spend hours going through and figuring out the different states, different regions, all sorts of different information. So now we're going to go down to the third item listed on this slide. And Isaac, this slide is showing again, is that
Yep.
correct? Number three is just something we've seen in years past. And this is really just a memo saying, yes, the allocations for the different states are out. In this case, for fiscal year 2025 for the lead service line replacement allocation. So it's really just announcing that. And then we would go to the number four item on this slide, and that is the actual allocations for the different states. And so we can click on that. This looks very similar to what we've seen in years past, where we have by state how much of the lead service line replacement allocation each individual state, the states receive, ultimately adding up to that 3 billion when you include the native systems, the set-asides for the native systems. And then on page two, that's called attachment B, really has information related to the additional subsidization allotment, and that's sort of that 49% generally through the grant. So we have another number on here for each different state and what they're allocated related to that. So that's an important item. So I just wanted to flash that briefly. So if we go back to the slide, and maybe I'll stop there, Isaac. I don't know if you have anything to add on that. If we go back to the slide here, number five, it talks about the fiscal year 25 and 26 allotments. So we just talked about, we now received, or EPA has received the inventories from all the different systems in all the different states. We see the allocation, or excuse me, the estimate of lead service lines going from 9 million to 4 million. And so there's going to be a different formula that can be used now that we have more information. So those states, now we have the most accurate data set to date for which states have the most lead or GRRs. So EPA really need to update that formula. So number five is the memo that talks about how that formula was updated. So we see now the states with the most need are going to be receiving the most money, and that formula is going to be used for this year that where the information was already put out, as well as fiscal year 2026 funding. And that brings me to number six on here, and this is actually a very important update, and it's basically talking about, and so we'll pull up this information. It's basically saying in fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24, some states did not take the money related to the lead service line replacement allocation. And we can see here in fiscal year 2023, it calls out a couple different states that they are ineligible for reallotment because they declined some of that money in 2023. Further down, we see the same for 2024. Some of these states decline. So basically, leftover funds from 23 and 24 are being reallocated again in 2025. And whether or not you can qualify for those funds as a state depends on if you declined those funds in the past. So we're going to go through these attachments at the bottom, and you're going to see some NAs in here. So those states are ineligible to apply for that money. Otherwise, you're going to see some potential numbers assigned to different states based upon what they might be able to qualify for. And we're not going to get into details here, but we're just showing that some states are eligible for different money from 23 and 24, and some states are not eligible if they did decline that funding.
This is one of those things that I remember at some conferences, like at the Council for Infrastructure Finance Authority, CIFA conference back in 2023. Folks were asking this question, like, what happens if a state doesn't distribute their funds or declines that? Is that going to get redistributed? Those were a lot of the questions that folks were saying, hey, what's going to happen if money isn't claimed? What's going to happen to those funds? Do they just go away? Again, this was a good move, in my opinion, by the EPA to say, hey, let's redistribute it when we have more information based on the 2024 inventories that were submitted.
Yeah, so we talk about that 3 billion number. It's kind of like around over 4 billion if we include those redistributions from the previous years that's now available.
Hmm.
So staying in sort of this allocation mode, number 7, what I have done, and this is not necessarily a resource that is available from EPA, but this is something that I put together simply by looking at the allocations to the different states in fiscal year 24, comparing them to what has come out in 2025. And so we sort of have three different scenarios here. In the green, we have the states that are receiving more funds in 2025 than they did in 24. In red, we have the states that are receiving less in 2025 than it did in 24, and obviously those in yellow, and there's sort of two columns there in yellow. Those are the states that it's unchanged, that their allocations remain the same. So if we go back and look at green, we see Michigan is receiving the most over 2024, and if we go to the red, Florida is receiving, the biggest reduction.
Yeah. And this tends to align with where the inventories indicated that there was more lead or GRR. So again, that aspect of the data was showing where more need was. So distributing the funds in that way makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think if we just kind of take a real quick visual of the states in green, here in a couple minutes, I'll be showing a map of what was turned in and which states have the most lead or GRRs. And obviously that map is going to kind of align a little bit with, or more fairly closely with the green states or the columns, the green columns. So going back to the list here, another resource that was released, number 8, and we're not going to open it up, but we're going to talk about it because there's some very important information on this particular memo. When we talk about lead service line replacement fund, what are eligible projects that can be funded through this allocation? We often hear, well, you can use it for inventory. Many states have done that. Many water systems have done that. Obviously, you can use it for replacing your lead service lines. Many states and many water systems are doing that. This particular memo clarifies a piece of information that had gone back and forth in the past, and also adds some eligibility for things that are eligible to be funded. So we'll start with number, or I guess 8A here. When the lead service line replacement funding originally came out, these galvanized requiring replacement pipes were eligible to be replaced with the lead service line replacement funding. Then there was some clarification that came out from EPA that they were not. Now we have an update that GRRs, or galvanized requiring replacement service lines, can be removed with funding from this lead service line replacement allocation for all fiscal years. And there's some information in the memo about how to go back if you submitted it and it wasn't included, how to get that included. And I also want to point out in the parentheses here, this includes galvanized that is downstream of a lead connector. Now, a lot of states don't necessarily consider the connector, or the gooseneck in this case, as part of the service line. Regardless, if you have a lead connector on a galvanized line, this funding can be used to replace that whole entire section. So that is one of the particular pieces, which is a very important, and a clarification that was made in this memo. And then going down to 8B, another very important piece of information where we've seen EPA, or we saw EPA come out with some information that says, maybe the reason that some of these lead service lines aren't being replaced as quickly as we think is there's some challenges to that, because they are in many cases, well, in all cases, attached to a main line. They most likely have a meter. Maybe they have a connector. And if the funding can only be used for certain components, many systems are like, this is too complicated, we can't use the funding. So this change essentially said, it made a list of integrated components, including main lines, including meters, including connectors. These integrated components are now eligible to be replaced with funding from this lead service line replacement allocation. However, my understanding is that is only eligible if the community classifies or qualifies for this disadvantaged community. Now, the disadvantaged community could be applicable to a whole entire water system or a pocket of a larger system. So
Mhm.
these are two clarifications from EPA that should enhance or increase the ability for a lot of systems to start thinking about submitting their project to the state SRF and getting funding to get these projects moving.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those aspects where the EPA is definitely the systems that are going to be favored in this are those that have shovel-ready projects. They've done their work. They're ready to put pen to paper and say, hey, in order to do this replacement where we also need to replace these things, this is what our cost is going to be, and we have our data house in order to say, hey, this is a disadvantaged community and we're ready to move. The only thing holding us back is the funding, which I think also does this other aspect where it uses more of that funding faster. So on one hand, we need the funds to go as quickly as possible to places of need, and that's important. But we also know, and we'll kind of talk about it in a little bit, that there's a limited pool of funds, and the $15 million that are set aside for out of the IIJA for replacement isn't quite, it is not just not quite enough. It falls pretty short of the needed investment to replace all lead and galvanized lines in the country.
Yeah, super helpful context, Isaac. And so back to the slide here, the ninth resource is literally just a form that you can certify that these integrated components are eligible for funding. And then on to resource number 10. When the IIJA funding was originally set up, there was a lot of questions. EPA created a Q&A document. This Q&A document has been updated. Several of the questions have new information because of these changes, and so just drawing attention to there's some updates to that Q&A document. So then we're going to jump down to number 11 and we're going to click on that because there's some important pieces in here. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The primary piece here that this fact sheet tries to relay is we now have this 4 million projected total lead service lines across the country. And that 4 million lead service lines includes GRRs. And as you can remember to the dashboard earlier, there's about 2 million lead and about 1 million GRR, which adds up to 3. And as I mentioned earlier, that 1 million that we don't know actually exists is an estimate based upon there's a lot of unknowns. There's 20 plus million unknowns left, so around a million of those unknowns are estimated to be either lead or GRR. That's where we get this 4 million estimate. And if we scroll down to the second page of this document, this is what I was talking about earlier. This is sort of a heat map for where is the lead. And this is sort of the first map where we've seen this map before that's been based upon some surveys. And this map obviously has been updated now that we have this most recent information. And so we see sort of Illinois, Ohio, New York kind of leading the charge with the most lines that are going to need replaced. Again, probably aligning with many of the states that are in the darker blues with the green table in that earlier slide. So Isaac, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I think it's important to remember that this is now an updated information, our most accurate we have, and so we can see which states truly have these lines that are going to need to be replaced
Yeah.
so we can allocate funds appropriately to those states.
Yeah. Yeah. Once again, it is that aspect of we pulled off this amazing feat of getting tens of thousands, over 50,000 inventories from all the water systems across the country. Any prior estimates were just that. They're pretty loose guesses simply based on perhaps age of home or those kind of things. But now we've got more concrete data to use, and we see that it's all in those favors, all in those places that have higher uses of lead in their uh, construction when lines were laid.
And I will just say, just to clarify, this slide or this mapping is the projected. So it includes the known plus the estimated 1 million. So this is not exact numbers here, but I think once we get to the exact numbers, this map is going to look very similar
Hmm.
in the exact versus the projected. All right, so that's going to take us to the next to last resource, and this is something we also want to show. It is a dashboard, and it's located at the bottom of the link that's on the slide that I have there. And while sometimes it takes a little bit to load, but while it's loading, I just want to kind of provide a little bit of background. This is the projected number of lines similar to the heat or the map that we just showed. This is what's the national landscape and then what's the state specific landscape of projected. And the projected is going to be what did all the water systems submit in the initial inventory, plus was there some unknowns? Most likely yes in all states. So let's add some estimated number of lead and GRR into those individual states. So that's what this dashboard is designed to kind of show more clearly than maybe the initial dashboard. And if we scroll down here, you can see there's the different states. And then moving further down, we can see that there is the table here of in each state, what's the projected lead, what's the projected GRR, what's the projected non-lead, and what's the total. So if you would add up all of the projected lead and GRR, that's going to get you to your 4 million service lines.
Yep. And Jonathan, we were talking earlier too about what are some rough estimates of the average cost of a lead service line replacement, and it hits around that, let's just say $10,000 to replace a service line, which when you add up the 4 million times 10,000, we're really needing 40 $40 billion to replace the service lines, and we're trying to work and distribute 15. And so there's really, again, mostly bringing that up to say the urgency is around if you're a water utility still working with unknowns, the quicker you get your data house in order and your plan put together, the more favored you are to be able to take action to get access to the funds, particularly if you're expecting to need to replace service lines.
Yeah, and in the 40 billion, let's just say we'll call that the maybe the latest projection if we're saying a 10K average for line. We have seen the 15 billion allocated through lead service line replacement. We've seen 12 of that essentially allocated with this 2025 allocation. I certainly would argue that the original year, so a lot of the money that's already been allocated, some of that certainly has gone toward replacement, but a lot of that has been inventory related. Certainly not all the 12 billion that's out there is being used for lead service line replacement. Then we go back to these integrated components. And if we have projects that are actually getting funded for these integrated components, is that going to drive up the cost of per line replacement? I certainly would think so. Is it double, is it triple? I don't know, but it's certainly going to increase the average. So these are all very important pieces with the latest information. So the final resource that I have listed here is simply an Excel file. If you click on that link, it's an Excel file which replicates the table at the bottom of that previous website where it talks about what are the projected lead and GRR from each individual state. And so it just has all the states on there with those projections. So, Isaac, that is sort of all that I had. I've done my best to list all of the different resources that came out last week, and there's a lot of them, and we've attempted to organize those. So that's all I've
Yeah.
got for today.
Yeah, well, we're going to distribute this as a PDF. It will also link to it in the comments here on the social post. Yeah, again, there's so much information. I think at a high level, to me, one of the biggest takeaways was how much it drives home and doubles down on promoting public transparency, making the data available, giving as much data information as possible out there, making it consumable in a way. And I think that was really good. It also really underscores the importance of having projects that are as ready as possible. And when we think about readiness, it really, again, comes down to, do I know what I have? Do I know what it's going to take? And am I ready to take action? Am I understanding what my definition of disadvantaged populations are, how that impacts how I'm going to sequence my lead service line replacement plan? And so there's there's still time, but we're running out of that time, and we need to continue to see some of this set up some of the next things that our country is going to need to face from an infrastructure investment standpoint. And so I think we've made a lot of progress, and there's a lot more progress still to still make. And so yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan, for helping us break down this massive information dump from the EPA 2 days before Thanksgiving.
Well, perfect. And thanks for setting up the ability to talk about it, Isaac.
All right.